"Get that mutt away from my window, Clara. He's scaring off paying customers." The voice of Mr. Lionel Carver cut sharply through the crisp morning air, carrying the weight of a man who had built his livelihood with flour-dusted hands and sleepless nights. His bakery, Carver's Hearth, sat at the corner of Maple Street, its sweet scent of warm bread and cinnamon rolls drawing in townsfolk each dawn. Yet, for the past 2 weeks, the same sight had greeted him, a dog, thin and weathered, sitting silently by the bakery door as though rooted there. Clara Carver. His daughter glanced at the animal with eyes that betrayed a quiet sympathy. "He's not hurting anyone, Papa," she replied softly, adjusting the apron tied around her waist. The dog, a medium-sized shepherd mix with patches of brown and gray fur, kept his gaze lowered but never strayed from his post. His ribs pressed against his skin like the lines of a broken cage, yet he carried himself with a strange dignity. Lionel grumbled under his breath and turned back inside, pushing open the bakery's glass door with a scowl. Customers were already forming a neat line, some whispering as they eyed the creature outside. To them, the dog was little more than a curiosity, a stray haunting the doorway of a place that smelled of comfort he could never buy. To Lionel, it was an intrusion. To Clara, it was a question begging for an answer. That morning was no different from the ones before. The dog rose as the bakery opened, tail low but wagging once as Lionel lifted the shutters. He would not bark, would not scratch, would not beg. He only sat, staring in at the baskets of bread rolls and loaves as though watching over something more than food. By mid-morning, Mrs. Everett, a widow who visited daily for her raisin scones, leaned toward Clara and whispered, "That poor creature looks like he's waiting for someone. Breaks my heart. Maybe he belonged to a traveler who never came back." Clara carried the thought with her as she kneaded dough behind the counter. She couldn't shake the feeling that the dog's silent vigil meant something. Every so often she would catch his eyes, amber flecked with an unspoken plea. Lionel, meanwhile, saw the whole thing as bad for business. "Mark my words, Clara," he muttered that evening while wiping down the counter. "If that stray doesn't move along, I'll have the constable deal with him. Customers won't come in if they think the place is crawling with vagrants." But the dog did not leave. Each morning, rain or shine, he appeared at the exact same spot, his paws neatly tucked, his body still as stone. His fur grew duller, his frame leaner, but his eyes remained bright with purpose. Clara tried offering scraps once, slipping him a crust of bread when her father wasn't looking. But to her surprise, the dog nudged it aside, not even sniffing it. He wasn't there for food. Word of the bakery dog began to spread through Maple Street. Children gave him names: Rusty, Shadow, Guardian. The butcher across the lane shook his head in disbelief. "Dogs don't sit like that unless they're trained to wait. He's not a stray, I'll tell you that much." Clara started to notice more. On the days Lionel scolded harshly at her or barked orders at the apprentices, the dog would lift his head higher as if standing guard over her. Whenever she stepped out to sweep the walkway, he would inch closer, stopping just short of her shoes, but never daring to touch. His silence spoke louder than any bark could. One Friday morning, as the town stirred for the weekend market, Clara overheard something that changed how she looked at the dog forever. An elderly man, Mr. Halberd, shuffled into the shop and peered out at the animal with a grim expression. "That's Samuel's dog," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Samuel?" Clara asked, startled. Mr. Halberd nodded, his weathered hands clutching a paper bag of rye bread. "Samuel Reed, worked down at the mill. Fine man, passed away last winter. That dog's been looking for him ever since." Clara felt her breath catch. She stared through the glass at the shepherd mix sitting loyally, tail resting motionless on the cobblestones. A dog mourning a man who would never walk those streets again, waiting still outside a place he once visited, or perhaps a place that reminded him of something more. Lionel scoffed when Clara told him later, "Dogs don't mourn, Clara, they move on. Don't fill your head with such nonsense." But even as he said it, his eyes flickered toward the doorway, lingering longer than usual on the animal who refused to leave. For Clara, the dog's presence no longer felt like a nuisance or a puzzle. It felt like a story unfinished, a question of love and loyalty written not in words but in patience. And deep inside, she knew she could not ignore him much longer. The rain had not stopped for 3 days, turning Maple Street into a river of gray puddles and dripping gutters. Yet, every morning, as Lionel Carver lifted the shutters of his bakery, the shepherd remained outside, soaked through, his fur plastered to his thin frame. He sat in silence, as though the storm itself could not move him. Customers began to murmur more openly now, some admiring the dog's endurance, others whispering about bad luck that came from an animal haunting a doorstep. Clara heard it all as she tied her apron tighter, her heart aching with each passing glance toward the window. On the fourth morning, as dawn broke over a sky swollen with more rain, Clara made a choice her father would not forgive. She slipped outside with a towel hidden beneath her arm. The shepherd raised his head when she approached, amber eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that sent a shiver through her. She knelt down, brushing water from his back. To her surprise, he did not flinch or back away. Instead, he leaned into her hand, just enough to acknowledge her kindness. That single, fragile moment felt heavier than words, a bond forming in the quiet drip of rain against stone. From inside, Lionel's voice snapped like a whip. "Clara, leave that animal alone before it follows you inside." His words cracked through the downpour, sharp with frustration but layered with something more. Clara caught the faint tremor in his voice, the kind that belonged not to anger, but to an old wound reopening. She stood reluctantly, whispering to the shepherd before slipping back into the warmth of the bakery. That night, when the shop was closed and the street lay empty, Clara lingered by the upstairs window. The shepherd was still there, curled against the door, shivering through the cold. She pressed her hand against the glass, wishing she could do more. Downstairs, she heard her father pacing the kitchen. He had been restless ever since the dog appeared, as if the creature's presence was stirring something he didn't want to face. The midweek brought a twist no one saw coming. The town's butcher, Mr. Gray, entered with a parcel of bread for his supper. He lingered near the counter before muttering, "Strange thing about that dog. I remember Samuel Reed. Used to stop by here every Saturday with him. Always bought a loaf, always broke off a piece to share right outside those steps. Never missed a week until he passed." Clara's breath caught. The ritual explained everything. The dog wasn't waiting for food, but for a moment that had defined his world. It was here that Samuel had given him companionship, here that he had known belonging. The bakery wasn't just a shop to the shepherd. It was the last place where love had lived. When she told her father, Lionel dismissed it with a wave of his flower-streaked hand. Dogs don't hold on to memories like that. They're creatures of habit, nothing more. Stop filling your head with nonsense. Yet even as he said it, he kept glancing toward the doorway. His words were brittle, his eyes shadowed. Clara saw it clearly now. His denial wasn't about the dog at all. It was about himself. The next evening, Clara dared to sit outside after closing, the shepherd by her side. She whispered softly, her fingers combing through his tangled fur. "He hasn't left you, not really. You carry him still." The dog leaned into her, his silent presence answering her in a language beyond words. For the first time since Samuel's name had been spoken, Clara saw tears shining in her own eyes. When she stepped back inside, she found her father standing in the shadows, watching. He said nothing, but the way his hands trembled told her what he refused to admit. The shepherd was no longer just a reminder of another man's loss. He had become a mirror for Lionel's own grief, a reflection of something buried deep and unspoken, and though the dog's vigil remained unchanged, Clara knew the story was shifting. The animal wasn't only waiting for a master who would never return. He was pulling at the walls her father had built, forcing both of them to face the weight of what had been lost and what might still be found. The morning fog lingered low over Maple Street, wrapping the bakery in a muted stillness. Clara lifted the shutters and immediately noticed the dog was different. He wasn't sitting as before, quiet and still. He was standing, his body tense, ears pricked toward the far end of the road. She paused with her hand on the latch, following his gaze. Out of the haze came the slow shuffle of footsteps, uneven and hesitant. At first, Clara thought it was another early customer, but then a boy emerged, no older than 10 or 11. His clothes hung in tatters, his hair matted, and in his arms he clutched a worn satchel against his chest as though it were the most precious thing he owned. The shepherd broke his vigil in an instant, bounding forward with a surge of joy that Clara had never seen in him. He barked, a sharp, desperate sound, and the boy dropped to his knees, throwing his thin arms around the animal's neck. The reunion was raw and fierce, the dog's body quivering with relief as if at last the waiting had ended. Clara stood frozen, her throat tight as she watched them. Customers began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Whispered questions rippled through the small crowd, but the boy ignored them all, pressing his face into the dog's fur. For the first time in weeks, the shepherd was no longer silent. He whined, he barked again. He pawed at the boy's chest as if scolding him for staying away so long. Lionel appeared at the doorway, his expression caught between irritation and disbelief. "Clara, get inside," he ordered, but his voice lacked its usual fire. His eyes lingered on the boy who clung to the dog with a desperation that could not be faked. Something in Lionel's hardened face faltered. When the boy finally lifted his head, his eyes locked on Clara's. They were wide, hollow, but burning with a kind of defiance that only suffering could carve. "He's mine," the boy said hoarsely, his voice trembling yet steady enough to carry. "Rusty's mine." The name struck Clara like a bell. The shepherd, now identified, pressed closer to the boy as if confirming it. Murmurs broke out among the onlookers, some nodding with recognition, others skeptical. Clara stepped forward carefully. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Evan," the boy replied, clutching the satchel tighter. His small frame shook, not from the cold but from exhaustion. Rusty waited. He waited for me. The revelation swept through Clara with an ache she couldn't put into words. All this time she thought the shepherd mourned Samuel Reed, but now another truth surfaced. Perhaps the man had left behind more than a faithful dog. The satchel the boy carried seemed heavy with meaning, but Lionel cut through the moment before Clara could ask. "Enough of this," he snapped, though his voice cracked at the edges. "The dog's been nothing but a nuisance here, and now a stray boy comes claiming him. Clara, get back inside." Clara turned on him sharply. "Can't you see? This is why he waited. Not for scraps. Not for us. For him." Her words rang out louder than she intended, and the silence that followed was heavy. Evan flinched at the argument, his thin shoulders curling protectively around Rusty. Clara noticed the way he gripped the satchel, and when the fabric shifted, she glimpsed the corner of a faded photograph peeking from its opening. Evan's eyes darted down as though afraid she had seen too much. The boy's sudden appearance unsettled Lionel more than he cared to admit. His hands shook as he gripped the doorframe. "Grief makes fools of us," he muttered, but even he could not deny the bond before him. Rusty had broken his silence for this boy, and the boy's eyes carried the same shadow Clara had seen in her father on sleepless nights when he thought no one was watching. Clara stepped closer to Evan, ignoring Lionel's protests. "Come inside," she urged softly. "Both of you. You don't have to stand out here anymore." For a moment the boy wavered, torn between fear and longing. Then he shook his head firmly. "No, Samuel told me never to bother strangers. He said people wouldn't understand." His voice cracked as he spoke the name. At the sound of it, Rusty pressed his head tighter against Evan's chest, whining as though confirming a painful truth. The name hung heavy in the air, and Clara felt the twist tighten around her heart. Samuel Reed hadn't only left behind a dog, he had left behind a child. The boy who stumbled from the corner of Maple Street was little more than a shadow of himself. His cheeks were hollow, his clothes threadbare, and his small hands clutched a weathered satchel to his chest as though it contained his very life. The shepherd rushed to him, tail wagging furiously, eyes alight with recognition and devotion. Clara gasped as she watched the animal transform from a quiet sentinel into a creature alive with joy. The boy collapsed onto the cobblestones, wrapping both arms around the dog's neck. He buried his face in its damp fur, sobs racking his fragile body. Clara ran forward, kneeling beside them, her apron brushing against the wet stones. "Are you all right? Where did you come from?" she asked softly, her voice shaking as she reached for his trembling shoulder. The boy flinched, but did not let go of the dog. Inside the bakery, Lionel watched from the window, his expression unreadable. He had spent weeks dismissing the shepherd's vigil as nothing more than animal stubbornness, yet the sight before him unsettled him deeply. He came out, his heavy boots splashing through puddles. His voice was harsh, but there was a crack in it. "Clara, bring that boy inside before the whole street gathers. The dog, too, if he won't let him go." The boy resisted at first, clinging tighter to the shepherd, but Clara coaxed him gently. "It's warm inside. Bread, too. Please, just for a moment." Finally, with a nod from the animal, the child allowed her to guide him into the shop. The dog padded close at his side, refusing to let more than an inch separate them. Once inside, the smell of fresh bread filled the air. The boy's eyes flickered toward the shelves, but he said nothing. Clara poured him a cup of warm milk, sliding it across the counter. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out and drank, his small hands shaking so badly the liquid rippled over the rim. When he was done, he wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve and whispered, "His name is Ash." He gestured toward the shepherd. "He was my father's." The room fell still. Clara glanced at her father, whose eyes widened ever so slightly at the boy's words. The connection between Samuel, the mill worker who had died, and the shepherd suddenly deepened. Clara leaned closer, her voice soft but urgent. "And you? Who are you?" The boy swallowed hard. "Daniel. Daniel Reed. Samuel was my father." His gaze dropped to the satchel in his arms. "After he died, everything changed. My mother fell sick. We lost our home. I tried to stay with neighbors, but they said I was too much to feed. Ash, he waited for me." "He always waits," Clara's heart twisted. Here was the truth behind the shepherd's vigil. He wasn't only mourning Samuel. He was holding on to the last bond of a broken family, waiting for the boy who carried his master's memory. Clara reached across the counter, resting her hand gently on Daniel's. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered, though the words trembled with a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Lionel shifted uncomfortably, his face taut. He wanted to protest, to tell Clara not to take on the weight of another family's tragedy. But something in the boy's voice struck him. He thought of Samuel, a man who had once come every Saturday morning, sharing a roll of bread with his dog. Lionel remembered their brief exchanges, nods, small talk, the kind of simple fellowship that filled a life quietly. Now that man's son sat in his bakery, clutching hunger and grief in equal measure. That night, when the bakery closed, Clara found Daniel and Ash curled together on a rug near the oven's warmth. The boy's face, though pale, was peaceful for the first time. Ash lay with his head on Daniel's chest, guarding him in sleep as he had guarded the bakery door. Clara's throat tightened at the sight. She knew their presence would test her father's patience, perhaps even threaten the bakery's fragile peace. But she also knew there was no turning them away now. Upstairs, Lionel stood at the window, staring down at the quiet street where the shepherd had once kept his lonely watch. His reflection stared back at him, lined with years of his own unspoken grief. He could not yet admit it, but he felt the pull of something he had long denied, an ache that mirrored the boy's loss, a recognition of loyalty and love too powerful to dismiss. As the lamps burned low and the town slipped into silence, one truth became impossible to ignore. The dog had not been waiting for bread, nor for pity. He had been waiting for the boy, and in finding him, he had forced open the doors of the bakery, and of hearts that had been locked shut for far too long. The days that followed brought a change to Carver's hearth. Customers who once whispered about the stray now entered the bakery with softened faces, their eyes lingering on the boy who sat near the oven with Ash faithfully at his side. Daniel helped Clara sweep the floor, stack baskets, and polish trays, his small frame moving with quiet determination. Though shy and fragile, his presence warmed the shop in ways bread alone never could. The shepherd followed every step, his amber eyes never leaving the boy, as though promising the world could not harm him again. Lionel, however, wrestled with the storm inside him. He kept his words curt, his instructions sharp, yet Clara noticed how often his gaze drifted toward Daniel when he thought no one was watching. At night, she found him standing at the kitchen doorway, his expression caught between resistance and surrender. For a man who had built his life behind walls of flour and discipline, opening his heart felt dangerous. The turning point came on a bitter morning when the frost clung to every window pane. The bakery was crowded, voices buzzing, when Daniel suddenly faltered while carrying a tray of rolls. His thin arms trembled, the basket tumbled, and the loaves scattered across the floor. Silence fell over the shop. Daniel's cheeks flushed crimson, his eyes wide with panic, and he bent quickly to gather the bread. Ash whimpered low, circling protectively as if to shield him from shame. For a moment, Lionel stood rigid behind the counter, his old self ready to scold. But as he looked at the trembling boy and the dog pressing against him in comfort, something within him broke. He saw not clumsiness, but hunger and fear carved into a child who had lost everything. He saw loyalty embodied in the animal who refused to abandon him. and he remembered the countless mornings Samuel Reed had come into the same bakery with a smile, buying bread not for himself, but for the family he cherished. Lionel stepped forward, kneeling beside Daniel. His voice was steady, but quieter than it had ever been. "Leave them, son. We'll bake more." Daniel looked up, startled, as Lionel reached out and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "From now on, you're part of this bakery. No more fear. Do you hear me?" The boy's lips trembled, but he nodded. Ash wagged his tail, brushing against Lionel's arm as if sealing the vow. Word spread quickly through Maple Street that Lionel Carver had taken Samuel Reed's boy into his care. Some spoke of kindness, others of duty, but Clara knew it was something deeper. Her father was finding himself again, unearthing a tenderness long buried under grief. He worked differently now, baking with Daniel at his side, teaching him the rhythm of kneading dough, the patience of waiting for bread to rise. Slowly, Lionel's stern exterior softened. Customers noticed. They lingered longer, not just for the pastries but for the sense of family that now radiated from the little bakery. For Daniel, the bakery became more than shelter. It became a place of healing. The satchel he had carried everywhere was gradually set aside. Its contents, his father's worn cap, a faded photograph, placed carefully on a shelf near the oven where warmth could keep them safe. Ash continued his quiet watch, but no longer at the doorway in the rain. Now he lay by the oven's glow, his vigil complete, his loyalty rewarded. One evening, as the shop closed and the lamps burned low, Clara watched her father and Daniel side by side, dusted with flour, laughing softly over a crooked loaf. It was a sound she had not heard from Lionel in years. She felt tears rise, not from sorrow but from the beauty of something mended. Later, when the street fell silent and the bakery rested, Lionel stepped outside with Clara. The night was crisp, the stars sharp above them. Ash padded out too, sitting at their feet. Lionel cleared his throat, his voice heavy with a truth long unsaid. "I thought grief was something you bury, Clara, but it waits. Just like that dog. It waits until you face it. And when you do, it doesn't destroy you. It makes room for love again." Clara slipped her hand into his, her heart swelling at the rare tenderness in his words. Together they stood, watching the shepherd settle beside the boy sleeping inside. Loyalty, loss, and love had intertwined to shape them all. And so, the bakery on Maple Street was no longer just a place of bread. It had become a place of remembrance, of healing, and of quiet devotion that would outlast even the hardest winters. The dog had waited, not for bread, but for belonging, and in waiting, he had given it back to them all.